scary stuff going on. And we all are trying to figure out how do we make it happen. I fundamentally believe that the climate crisis is primarily a crisis of leadership. Say that again. Climate crisis is primarily a crisis of leadership. It's not that we don't know what we need to do. We don't know how to mobilize people to do it. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. How can we get people mobilized to do the work they need to do? That's leadership as a verb, but we do have some amazing leaders with us tonight. We're honored to have 4 people really making a difference in the world. Before I introduce them, I'm going to invite people to come just a little closer. If you don't mind, I'm going to embarrass you. Yeah, it's like a church, you know, come on.
You seats in the front row as always.
You don't have to be in the front row. And if you're eating, that's fine. But just, you know, we want to have, we're sorry we have this big podium up here, but we want to have an intimate conversation.
Are you blocking? Do you want to swat here?
Maybe I'll just, how's that? Oh, thank you.
Okay.
So if we define leadership as mobilizing people to do the work we need to do, and if we define a crisis as primarily a crisis of leadership, then we need real leaders making a difference. And we have 4 of them tonight. I'll start person closest to me. Jerry Tiniano is the proprietor of West Herb, which provides consulting services to local governments, businesses, and interest groups that want to influence policy. West Herb helps their clients develop sustainability and climate action programs that result in dramatic results at scale. Jerry previously served as Denver's first Chief Sustainability Officer, and he earlier directed the Ohio office of the National Audubon Society. So he's not experienced across all 3 sectors as well. Trained as a lawyer, he practiced commercial trial law for over 20 years. Thanks for being here, Jerry. Dr. Sharon Jay is a manager at Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency, where she is responsible for implementing Denver's building performance policy. Sharon has more than 20 years of experience in project facilities management and sustainability for education facilities. She holds degrees in business administration, project management, and educational leadership, and she has authored sustainability guides for carbon footprinting and waste management. Thanks for being here, Sharon. Dr. Paul Sutton is a geographer and the University of Denver professor whose work focuses on sustainability, ecological economics, and population geography. He uses advanced imagery to measure human impacts on the Earth. He serves on several international panels and working groups, including the EU Commission's Human Planet Initiative. He's also a trustee for the town of Morrison. Thanks for being here. Mike Smith is a graduate of the Naval Academy and left his active duty with the rank of commander. Got that right, didn't I? More or less. Mike is a founder of Acclimate, purpose to make net zero available to all. Acclimate began as a project Renew West, which was also founded by Mike. Renew West develops natural climate solutions for the American West and beyond, including the largest scale, single carbon focused reforestation project in the US history. Thanks, Mike, for being here. So we're going to do a couple rounds of moderated conversations and then open it up as quickly as possible. So if you have some questions, note them down. If you really feel like there's something you've got to add in a conversation, just make yourself known and we'll try to get you in earlier. But we're going to try to go through a couple rounds really quickly. In the first round of questions, I'm going to ask each panelist to spend only 2 or 3 minutes on it and answer 3 questions. What's your current work? What are the intended outcomes of your work? And what are the challenges to being successful? Eric, why don't you kick it off?
Mark, before I answer this, because this is Council on Foreign Relations, I have to ask all of you out here, be honest. How many of you were model United Nations nerds like me? I had a feeling. Okay, the three questions. So my current work, I have my own business, Western Urban Sustainability Advisors, western.com. And I help local governments do climate action planning, sustainability planning, programs, policy work, and so forth. Mostly in Colorado, but sometimes outside of Colorado. I have a very interesting project up in Big Sky, Montana. Right now, I'm on a bid to do some work over in Park City, Utah, and so forth. The intended outcome is basically to help these communities achieve the successes that we achieved in Denver when I was the Chief Sustainability Officer. We set some very ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals for our city. 2013, we set the goals. Target year was 2020. We met our 2020 greenhouse gas reduction goal 2 years early. And it was a total greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal, not per capita. I think we're the only city in the United States that set a very ambitious goal and met it 2 years early. We were also certified at the platinum level in the U.S. Green Building Council's League for Cities and Communities program, one of only 6 cities to get that. We were on the CDP international group that watches climate action work around the world. We were on their A list among top cities and so forth. So what we're trying to do is take the lessons learned as Chief Sustainability Officer in Denver and achieve similar successes for these other cities and counties and local governments around the country. And the challenges and barriers that I would say the biggest one is really that communities that I work with are often reluctant to do everything necessary to make a sustainability plan a true plan, or a climate action plan a true plan. You know, for example, we did a climate action plan for a big county near here. I'm just going to leave it at that. A big county near here last year. And when we said you need to attach a department to every one of the strategies in this plan, so we know who's responsible. Because you can't have a plan unless you know who's responsible for doing it. And they said we are institutionally incapable of doing that. We live in silos. We're a big government. We live in silos. We're not used to distributing responsibilities. We'll get around to it eventually. I could give many examples of that happening in planning. It's a big problem. It's a big frustration. But my time is up, so I'm going to turn it over to Sharon.
Hello, everyone. Very nice to be here. The building performance policy that I manage, the team that implements the policy for the city of Denver, the policy requires that buildings over 5,000 square feet have to reach some level of energy efficiency by 2030. Our larger buildings over 25,000 square feet have to hit an energy use intensity by 2030, and our smaller buildings have to do a prescriptive upgrade. They either have to do LED lighting or cover a certain percentage of their energy use in solar. And so that's 9,000 buildings in the city of Denver that have to do something in the next 6 years, basically. And so it's pretty intense. Denver was the 5th city in the country to implement this type of policy. Washington, D.C. was first, New York was second. And everybody's still in the rule of implementation, or I haven't even had my rules yet. That our rules have been done for a little bit over a year. And so there's a lot of challenges around that. This is a paradigm shift for facilities to understand that they are actually being regulated on their energy efficiency where they haven't in the past. For facility managers, which is my background, facility managers have been dying to do this energy efficiency work for a long time. And if they were successful, or are our high performing buildings now, but for our building owners that weren't necessarily willing to invest the money, this is a huge paradigm shift. Like, let's take 1% of your profits that you had last year, invest it into your building, and you will probably meet these regulations. And some building owners and stockholders and things like that are sometimes just not willing to have the conversations. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have as a building industry is, for one, just getting people trained up so that they understand that these are regulations and we have to do this work and everybody benefits at the end. So improved return on investment, improved indoor air quality, improved health and well-being of the occupants of the building that we, work, live, and play in. But there is this group of buildings and buildings owners that we have classified as equity priority buildings, that they're under-resourced, they don't have facility managers, they don't understand what they need to do. And so Denver has actually created a program for these buildings where we are giving them free technical assistance to help them figure out how to improve their buildings. And I think nationwide, there's another 40 jurisdictions at the city and state level that are working on implementing these kind of policies. So this is happening everywhere. Right now, it's just we're in the infancy of it and we haven't hit a whole compliance cycle. So we don't know exactly, like, are people actually going to do what we ask them to do? So it's an interesting place to be, but one of the biggest issues is how do we help these under-resourced buildings join in on the way to energy efficiency and a high-performing building instead of leaving them behind. And that's going to be a huge lift, I think, for our cities and states to be able to put together the programs to help those buildings. Instead of just making their target easier to do, we need to help them get to the same place as all of the other buildings. And I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, I teach at the University of Denver. I teach classes like satellite image processing, GIS, computer mapping, and I'm hopefully training students to be environmental accountants in the future. Like, we're going to have to, one of the challenges that I think barriers is getting human beings to understand their fundamental dependence upon functioning ecosystems. I write op-eds in newspapers to affect change with titles like The Nature of Value and the Value of Nature. And so I do things like ecosystem service evaluation. So I've taught at the University of Denver for about 20 years. And a common criticism I got in my course evaluations from students was, you're teaching me about climate change, you're teaching me about the extinction crisis, you're teaching me about ocean acidification, you're teaching me about half the coral reefs are dead, half the wetlands are gone. You're teaching us that the Titanic is sinking. And they wanted solutions orientation. So based on that feedback from my students, I ran for office. And so I'm now on the board of trustees of the town of Morrison, the town that I live in. And we're engaged in working with people like Jerry. And I also sit on DRCOG as a result of being on the board of trustees in the town of Morrison. So I'm on DRCOG, and we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions inventories and how do we get this. And I'm in the interface because I've been trying to electrify the cars in our police department. I deal with police officers that don't want to drive electric cars. So I brought a solutions orientation in my classrooms by participating in local government. Thirdly, I'm serving on the United Nations Global Environmental Outlook as an author on a chapter that's associated with scenarios of the future and the viability of those scenarios. And one of the scenarios is business as usual, which, trust me, is not effective. The other one is innovation will save the day, sort of a green growth philosophy as we go forward. Solar panels and wind turbines, that we can innovate our way out of this and we can basically keep capitalism going. And the other one is more of they're calling it a behavioral adaptation, which is a phrase because they don't want to say degrowth. The degrowth is something that I hope we can talk about tonight, because there's this great debate between the Bill Gateses and the Bill McKibbins whether we can keep growing or we actually have to engage in degrowth. And to me, that is the biggest barrier. The scientists that I know, the IPCC report, the IPBES report, which is the Internet Intergovernmental on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, they're saying that there's two things that have to happen. And this is in the spirit of Yogi Berra. If you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And where the scientists believe we have to go is we have to go to a place that has a lower global human population, and we have to have a lower GDP per capita. And that is a barrier that probably would be contested in this room, whether people want to talk about whether we really have to get to a lower total global population and lower GDP per capita. And I think we could have a great life for people and have high levels of well-being with a smaller population and lower GDP per capita. I am a scientist that thinks the rules of nature are not negotiable and we have to live with this reality. And I applaud the efforts of people on this panel to make the changes we have to make here. But the changes that have to be made are different geographically. Primarily in the United States, we have to reduce our material and energy consumption, but there are parts of the world that are so impoverished that have to increase their material and energy consumption. So you're going to have spatial variability as to what policies are needed in different parts of the world. That's a complicated thing to communicate. That's a delight.
Yeah, so coming from a little bit of a different background, this has nothing to do with flying airplanes. Yeah, my personal experience started when I experienced wildfires as a kid, and 22 years later, brought my wife at the time to Idaho to work for a restaurant. I wasn't excited. I was going to be part of the solution, and one of the things that has frustrated me on my career, both in my time in the Navy and since then, is that there's a lot of people that do a lot of thinking and not a lot of people that do a lot of doing. And there's got to be kind of a bridge between that. And not to cast aspersions upon the people that are doing the thinking. It's important. Like this, there's important science. I come from a family of scientists. It's important. But there's a kind of a component when you think as an entrepreneur about like they call the product adoption curve. Like there's kind of like those early adopters that are pushing really hard, and eventually you have to kind of hit this point of inflection where you engage the majority of people. And we're starting to see things like that, like electric vehicles. You know, kind of a standard product adoption curve would be something like my father bought a Honda Insight back when it was a terrible car. Got consistently 50 miles per gallon with that thing for its entire couple 100,000-mile lifespan. Went through 3 different batteries, rode like hell. The only thing that it did better than everything else was it was very fuel efficient, right? So, and it looked like a spaceship. My dad loved it because it made him look weird. You're not going to get a whole lot of adoption if you make everybody look weird, right? And then, you know, the next layer out is usually the people that like to think of themselves as innovators, but are really just kind of following the true innovators, right? These are your early adopters. These are the people that bought like the Tesla Model S. They really wanted it for performance. They wanted to look cool. They wanted everybody to think they were that. And then ultimately you get to the people that are more like buying like Ford F-150 Lightning stuff, right? Like they're seeing this as how it fits into their life. And that's where we got to get to. That's how we've got to engage the majority of people. And so my thesis was, I was working at, in my previous company, Purdue West, right, called the tree planting. I was starting to get a little depressed because I was like, to be blunt, plant all the trees you want, they're all going to burn if we don't stop the planet. And I was working as an advisor to the U.S. Climate Natural Climate Solutions, carbon markets. These are all the 26 states that stayed in the Paris Accords after the Trump administration pulled south. And smart people, motivated, cared about climate, paid to care about climate. And they were having a hard time engaging with the topic. I was like, man, we are so hosed if we can't figure out a way to make this more approachable to everybody. And so that's the thesis behind Acclimate is that like, how can we, climate action, in my opinion, is a collective action problem. And there's a lot of framing that it's either A or B, but it's really kind of both. And like actually our superpower here is the relationships that we have in voting systems and the world economy, and how can I empower people to make those decisions in the right ways. So that's Acclimate. We provide software for small to medium-sized businesses. I think it's really like the most critical node in the U.S. economy to engage in decarbonization. To put it another way, there's very little research about this, but economic activity typically correlates very strongly with emissions output. If the U.S. small business sector were in its own country, it'd be the 4th largest emitter on the planet. Don't have any proof of that because nobody's done any research because nobody really cares about it because a lot of the people that are the early adopters tend to think from like a top-down standpoint. But I think we're at this inflection point where it's this bottom up and we need to start engaging. So that's me with that.
Hey, thank you all. You know, what I'm hearing is 4 people who all kind of share a systems perspective about certainly understanding how all the natural systems interrelate, how change the environment from human activity has affected that, but also have a pretty keen understanding of the human ecology of it all, the relationships, the systems of people. They've all found a piece that they can hang on to and try to figure out how they can make a change from that perspective. I'm going to challenge them in the next set of questions to think about how their own work affects the wider world. Because we know climate is a result of decisions and actions and interactions of many organizations and individuals and, and entities from all the sectors. So it's a systems problem. There isn't one solution. It's complex. And our individual actions as consumers will not alone fix the problem. We need bigger fixes than that. And we also know that the climate crisis is embedded with other issues. It's not just climate. We can't affect climate policy without effective governance. Whether that's at an international level, a national level, or as Jerry described in his example, you know, local government saying we don't have the ability to execute across departments. So governance is just totally intertwined. And climate change and climate policy will both directly affect inequality and injustice issues around the world. There'll be winners and losers for sure, but how we act, how we fail to act will determine who are some of those winners and losers. And technology, including AI, may be part of the solution and maybe part of the problem. So let's turn a little bit and just see how our 4 leaders see how their work interacts with this broader complex world. So I'm going to do a second round of questions and ask everyone to keep this one to 2 minutes to give us time again for us all to be able to talk together. So it's just simply, how does your work affect the wider system, or how do you hope it will? And what have you learned from similar efforts around the world to what you're trying to do? And what learnings do you think your work demonstrates that can be shared with others? I'll go the other way, start with. Yeah.
Hope you like hearing my voice. So one of the stats that I think sticks with a lot of people in climate, and it's true and false, is the idea that 71% of the world's emissions come from 100 companies. And that's a true statement. It is, depending on how you account for it. And so I'm going to give you all a very quick and slightly dirty carbon accounting lesson, which is the idea is that when you look at carbon accounting, there's something on a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 emissions are things that you're responsible for. You burned it, your refrigerator leaked it, emitted it. Machinery that you directly are responsible for, that did it. Scope 2 is generally electricity. There's some other stuff there, but essentially, like, these lights are all being run by Excel. The power plant at Cherokee Station is burning coal right now. And so we are all benefiting as a result of that. Scope 3 is everything else. There's 15 categories of it. It goes from investments, it goes, a lot of different stuff. And historically, Scope 3 was how the large oil companies got away with saying, well, it's not really our responsibility. Because they would say, well, the embodied carbon associated with the product we sell, somebody else is buying it. That's their Scope 1. It's our Scope 3, but we don't, if they're responsible for it, they need to deal with it, right? So that's scope emissions, and it's a fine accounting structure. It's got its flaws, but it's an okay accounting structure if you're trying to understand this from like a large corporate sustainability kind of mindset. But the reality of it is what scope emissions really describes are relationships. And so the false part of this, of the 71% come from 100 companies is also that Shell's kind of right. We all participate in the fossil fuel economy, right? And so so historically what that means is just like we were doing here, is pointing both fingers. Well, it's them, it's them. The reality is it's both. It's a relationship, right? And so to shout at everybody and say like, hey, no, the real problem is we need to go fight these fossil fuel companies. Yeah, okay, sure. But also we need to take responsibility for our own actions. Because the way in a collective action problem for this to work is for us all to collectively act. And the way for us to collectively act is to recognize that your individual decisions don't move the front that far, but collectively, many footsteps make an army. Okay, and so to recognize that your real power is relationships. It's how you participate in voting systems. It's how you participate in economic systems. And thinking about where your footprint is and making emissions-related decisions according to that, I think is the real power. And so that's the one thing that I try to get out to everybody is don't let it be a us versus them sort of thing, because ultimately that means inaction. What it really has to be is about taking responsibility for your own behavior while also insisting on others to take responsibility for theirs.
I'm a scientist at a university. I engage in research, and a lot of people like to say, well, baby boomers made this mess, but it's also baby boomer scientists that helped figure out that climate change was happening. And it was baby boomer scientists that recognized the hole in the ozone layer. And they were accused of being communist sympathizers. That captains of industry wrote letters to the provost of their university telling them to revoke their tenure, fire them. So I think scientists have done a lot of the job with respect to getting us to finally realize that climate change is happening. And their models suggested that sea level was going to rise, we're going to have increased fire. The scientists' models with respect to climate change are way better than economists' models. The economists did not see the global financial crisis coming. They don't know what to do about inflation right now, but the scientists have done a pretty good job of that. So I see myself as a scientist that's sort of doing thinking rather than doing, more so, hopefully to raise awareness to motivate action. They say truth passes through 3 phases. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as having always been true. And I think climate change is going through all of those, and it's more accepted as being true now. But the scientists don't get to say, I told you so. They're like, why didn't you warn us more strongly? One of the things that I've engaged in as a scientist is in this, the value of nature and the nature value. I've engaged in ecosystem service evaluation. I've published lots of papers on the dollar value of things that nature does for us. And that includes things like carbon sequestration, but it also storm protection provided by wetlands, bee pollination. And our assessments are, when we do plausible evaluations of the dollar value of ecosystem services, it's bigger than the entire market economy, which means that you can't fix the market economy by internalizing little externalities that are very small. And so the point I'd like to make with respect to this is, what it does is it exposes that our values are kind of messed up. You might buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks for $5. And our accounting system, if you pay with a credit card, it'll be in computers, and who knows where the storage of that transaction is, and it'll last forever. But in the hour you spent buying and drinking that cup of coffee, the species went extinct, and we probably didn't even name it. Right? We spend $12 billion for Halloween, lawn ornaments, candy, and costumes. For one day, we spend $12 billion for one day holiday. The entire annual budget for our National Park Service is $4 billion. So we're going to have to change what we spend our money on. And people aren't going to like doing that. We're going to have to pay people to pay attention to species going extinct rather than counting Kim Kardashian's profits from selling. Right? This is a huge shift. So I feel that one of my successes was engaging in, assessing the value of nature. The work that I've done with many other scientists in terms of ecosystem service valuation has ended up in, presidential memorandums from President Obama that all government agencies have to take into account the value of ecosystem services or nature's contribution to people in their decision making. So that is a contribution that I feel I've made. And We need doers, we need thinkers, we need people that are tracking bills.
Regulators.
Absolutely, I think all of us are trying to participate in the process in the ways that we can. I'll have to share.
For Denver, our greenhouse gas emissions, buildings make up 50%. So the other big chunk is transportation. And then you have little itty bitty slivers that are wasting some of these other things. So if you don't address existing buildings, not just new, it's really easy to build a new building as a high performing building and low in carbon and that kind of thing. But it's our existing building stock that is the issue. Because only so many new buildings are made, or only so many buildings are renovated each year, and which is where the building performance policy idea came from with the American Cities Climate Challenge with Bloomberg Philanthropies that kind of helped take some of the scientists and all of this work that predecessors have done and said, well, okay, if we don't address existing buildings, we're not going to make any progress whatsoever. So that's where building performance policies come from. But it's not just I'm going to address this one building. Like I said, our policy covers 9,000 buildings in Denver, and they're all going to be expected to do this really crazy work over the next 7 years. So there's green workforce development that has to happen so that we have people who could actually then go into the buildings and do the energy audits and do the contractors to do the work. There's also some other accompanying policies that Denver is working on. We have in the same ordinance that created the building performance policy is a policy to electrify your building code over time. And so that's looking at the space and water heating equipment. And in our 2025 code and 2027 building code, we are going to be putting in requirements in there that if you replace your existing system or you build a building new, that you are going to have to electrify your equipment so that as we green the grid, everything's on solar or renewable sources instead of natural gas or fossil fuels. And so I might give you an example of one of these things that's happening. We've tried really, really hard to build our policy through stakeholder engagement and engaging with our constituents. And we had a task force that put together the actual ordinance that went in front of city council to then put it into law. But then we also worked on stakeholder engagement. One of the, to actually build out how we were going to implement the policy. Because I want the building owners to actually make the improvements to their buildings, not pay the penalties that they may see if they do nothing. And we're trying to work through all of these issues. One of the biggest issues that's come up is in certain areas of Denver, our electrical grid is at capacity, and downtown Denver is one of them. So if you try to electrify your space and water heating equipment, you probably don't have the capacity either in your building, or Excel is telling you you don't have capacity in the building, and they won't be able to upgrade your service to do that because the downtown grid is at capacity. And so we're trying to work through some of these issues as a system. We're talking with Excel, we're talking with our building owners, we're talking with community planning and development that actually enforce the building code, and all of these different people bringing them together. So we've ended up working out this issue of, well, Excel doesn't really want to approve the infrastructure necessarily unless somebody tells them to do it, like our Public Utilities Commission. So what we're trying to do right now is build out this structure where a building owner, if they want to electrify their equipment or actually have to hit our energy use intensity targets, and they run into this wall with Excel, we say, okay, here's a template of the questions that you can ask Excel of exactly what your issue is so we can gather information. And here's a way that you can make a public comment to the Public Utilities Commission that is currently going through a particular policy update on their rules to try and see what system capacity issues there are, you know, in our area that would put barriers in front of our electrification of our grid and our equipment. And so working through all of these things, you all have a place in our policy making and stakeholder engagement on how we do these policies with the Public Utilities Commission. If you've run into an issue, to let them know, I can't electrify my building because Excel says I can't. And then the Public Utilities Commission can make these system-wide changes that says, well, no, they are going to have to. And so there's all of these nuances in almost every single one of the policies that you can think of where you actually have an opportunity to get involved. So it's not just the policymakers that are now regulating the buildings and saying you have to do this, but there's all these different points of interaction and things like that, where you guys can actually get involved in making the policies, implementing the policies, trying to help improve our systems. And I would like to encourage you all, if you have any questions about that, just come see me afterwards, we'll talk. Because I could probably give you an idea of what you're interested in and who you can talk to and get involved. So I'll turn it over to Jerry.
Thanks, Bart. I think I'm gonna focus on the international part of your question, because I'm a UN nerd. You know, the solutions are out there internationally. The political will is lacking in the United States, the state of Colorado, and yes, even in the city and county of Denver. I'm gonna give you 3 examples. London has had a congestion fee for over 20 years now. It's a fee to get into the center part of the city at rush hour, what you'd say. Very successful in every way. We know the congestion fee works, and we know that it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it will reduce air pollution, it will make people healthier, it will lead to fewer car crashes like we have here in Denver and elsewhere. We know it works. Holland, most of my mother's family is Dutch. I'm over there a lot, bike in every part of that country. I use transit. I was there last year. And, you know, politicians like Mayor Hancock, when I was chief sustainability officer, they go over to Amsterdam or Copenhagen or Utrecht or someplace like that, and they see the bike system and they say, why can't we have this in our city? We can have this in our city. You know, they did it. Why don't we do it? And there's a very simple answer. Because in Holland, for example, they put prices on gasoline, car ownership, and parking that are way beyond anything we do. When I was in Holland last time, the price of gas was $2.50 a gallon higher than here. And it's not because gasoline costs more over there, it's an international commodity. It costs the same everywhere. It's because they put a tax on it that we don't put. And if you want to transfer ownership of a car, if you want to acquire a car in Holland, there's a huge tax on it. My family, when they buy a new car, it's a big deal that they were finally able to get a car. They were able to afford it. Parking, the cost of parking in The Hague, for example, where one of my cousins lived, he has to pay to park on the street in front of his house. We don't have to do that in my neighborhood in Denver. And what do those 2 things have in common? The congestion fee and all those fees in Holland, they send a price signal to the consumer that it's cheaper to do something other than drive, and they create revenue to create those wonderful trams and train systems and bike infrastructure and so forth that they have over there. But we are institutionally incapable of doing that here. We will not put a price on those things. We haven't changed the gas tax in this country since 1993. In Colorado, we passed something called TABOR, which makes it very, very difficult to do what they've done in the EU. And the last example I'll give you is procurement. I was one of 3 Americans that served on the global executive committee of a group called ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. And I held the portfolio in sustainable procurement, which I shared with the mayor of Malmö, Sweden. And let me tell you, the EU is really, really good at sustainable procurement. They have a lot of rules, they have big conferences, they train on it, they interact with each other, they combine their purchasing power and so forth. And, you know, you've heard of divestment. You know, divestment is very ineffective as a tool for fighting climate change. But procurement, you know, you can only divest once, but you can use your checkbook every year. And so procurement is another great tool that works very well over there, but we just don't do it over here. We don't really do it at the state level. We don't do it at the municipal level. So let me wrap up by just saying the solutions are out there. We should feel good about that. The political will in this country, state and city are lacking, but with the participation of people like you, maybe we can change that.
So we know what to do. We need to find the political will to do it. What's holding us back? I'm curious what you all think. Let's open this up to some questions. We are roving.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Michael. I was just going to quickly ask about the driving thing. Would love to not drive into Denver, but the entire infrastructure, the entire setup, it's not half around cars. It's not 70% around me coming in by car. It's 100% around me coming in by car. I have no other way to get into Denver but hop in my car and drive down. I just had to throw that statement out.
Well, two comments, during my 7 years as chief sustainability officer, I rarely used a car to commute down to my office. I biked most of the time. I took public transit. And it's not easy. And the reason I was able to do that is because I moved in here and already knew where I was working, could make a choice as to where I live. But a lot of people are locked in. They're locked in and they can't do that. One interesting solution that I've urged municipalities everywhere to look at is remote working. This may surprise you, but when I took over as chief sustainability officer, our car commuting was about 68%. Commuting was done by driving alone. We set a goal in 2013 to reduce that to 60% by 2020. Do you know what it actually was in 2020? According to the American Community Survey, 53%. And none of that was bicycling. We built all these bike lanes, we built all this infrastructure, we're giving away e-bikes or reduced price. That number, percentage of people commuting by bike, has barely moved in 11 years. But working at home exploded after COVID and is consistent. So you may have difficulty, doing anything other than with a car. But fortunately, we don't have to solve the problem for everyone. We just have to solve the problem for a lot of people. And my suggestion that we look at in this area for climate change is be a lot more focused on how we deal with remote working and how we make it work for us. Because I don't know if anyone even in Denver City government knows this, we blew past that 60% number by 2020, and no one was even paying attention, but it was a great success, and we know what did it. We should just do more of it.
I would say maybe get involved in with RTD and when they ask for public comment to make a statement or something like that, because a lot of these organizations actually do listen. I have the exact problem. I am in a place where I would have to drive to a local station, and then it would take me almost 3 times as long on RTD to get into downtown than me driving, and that's just it's not worth the time. So, as somebody who works for the sustainability office, it makes me cringe every single time, but I just don't have a lot of options. But trying to get the voice heard, that if we have enough people saying, can we do this or can we do that, or can we improve bike infrastructure or doing these rebates. I mean, the rebates for the e-bikes have made a significant change in the past year or two. And if we keep doing that, but I'm not one of those, I live far enough away that the e-bike is not necessarily going to fix it. So we even have somebody in our office at the moment who volunteered to be on RTD's board and applied and actually got a position on RTD's board. So we now have representation within their governmental structure to try and improve things, because we know that's an issue. And so I think there's an opportunity to have your voice heard. And if we have enough people making the voice heard, like the ballot initiative that created the climate protection fund that made my office explode by 4 or 5 times in size in the last 2 years, that's what we want to work on. So if you get enough voices together, you can make some significant change. It's just trying to get involved and going from there. I don't know if you guys.
I'll make a brief comment. I sit on Dr. Cog and we see these transportation studies, and it blows my mind every time. They have 10 or 15 little paths that they check how long it takes to get from point A to point B on public transportation, and it's uniformly twice as long as driving in a private vehicle. I think Jerry has made a really important point, is we're going to have to get really smart about realizing what really reduces car use, and it's working at home. It's not free fares on MTD. It's not encouraging bike to work day. Working at home, but that has other effects where people get isolated, and then congestion pricing can be inequitable because it's easy for rich people to pay the congestion pricing. So it's kind of a mess. And then in terms of political will, Dr. Cog is putting up transportation bonds, and they're always trying to figure out how to get the people of Colorado to raise their own taxes to address congestion transportation problems. And we always say, nah, We vote no on our transportation bonds, and so Goldman Sachs comes in and provides the money, and we get a public-private partnership, and then we get the Goldman Sachs lane on 36 to Boulder, and we get the Goldman Sachs lane on C470, we get all, and they bump it up to, you have to have 3 people in the car in order to be a high occupancy vehicle, so, you know, sometimes you have to look at the enemy, and it's us. We always say no to taxes, and we're gonna have to start paying for things, or buy less Halloween candy.
I guess the only thing I'd add to that is that I don't think about it as like an economic as much as like a utility question. And so living in Europe for a few years, I know that one of the reasons that people don't drive is because it's a pain in the butt to drive. And so, you know, the other part is like if you want to encourage biking, it's not about bike lanes, it's about like why can't my kid ride there? I don't feel safe to bicycle with my kid to school because there's no safe spot for him to ride with me. And so it's really more about like, I think you just have to start taking certain streets out of circulation. You have to change the calculus about that, about like making more bike, more walk focused, a lot less car focused. I think there's definitely a tax and finance component to it. And I think that helps fund public transportation. A lot of people talk about like kind of looking back at the good old days of, you know, streetcars. People didn't love streetcars, they loved mobility. They love the idea of that, like that, you know, we like to think about trains, but it's really, I mean, buses could work on the same streets, you know, very cost effective. You don't have to have a whole lot of new infrastructure. Very, you know, I like riding the bus. And so I think if you started to put more streets into bus only, more streets into bike only, and start making it more difficult for cars to drive, I think you would start changing the calculus pretty quickly. That probably doesn't make your commute shorter. You know, it may, because more money might be going into mass transit and you might have more mobility solutions available to you. If there was a bus driving by every 5 to 10 minutes, you'd probably take it, right? But it definitely changes the calculus about how people engage with transit options.
This question comes to us from Zoom. Is our current system of post-industrial and service-based capitalism congruent with addressing climate change at all? And specifically, given the large gap between the rich and the poor in this country, is it really possible for members of the working class to access climate change solutions?
No. What I will say, though, is like I take some good thoughts with the work that's been happening on our building performance policies, because all the cities, the states that are working on these policies, because they are so new and we're still figuring out how to, you know, really make them work and haven't even gotten to the end of the compliance cycle. We're all talking to each other, and one of the biggest things that we talk about is equity. Like, how do we not leave this group of folks or group of buildings or things like that behind, and actually, if we do have funding, which the federal government is throwing all kinds of really neat funding out there, you know, we are actively working on how do we implement these policies equitably, making sure we listen to those communities as we're building out the policy, and then actually putting money into technical assistance programs. Now, it's not happening everywhere in every single type of policy, but at least on the building performance side, all of the people that I've talked to are trying to take into account things where capitalism have left certain groups behind, or redlining, or frontline communities that just haven't had the resources to be able to do what they need to do. So I see encouraging signs, but I also see, like, a building owner, there was a rulemaking that happened at the state level on manufacturing emissions just very recently. And industry had some really big wins in this rulemaking. We were all pretty upset from a local government perspective and advocates. And you know, when Suncor puts up this sheet and says, well, for us to hit these greenhouse gas emission reductions that you say we have to hit by 2030, we're going to have to reduce production, which then totally freaks out the government and the governor and all of this kind of things. But then you look that they gave up, like, they put up $7 billion in profits. That wasn't their total, you know, sales. It was profits. I was like, you can't spend $10 million on improving your plant, you know, to actually do that. But Industry 1 is super big on that particular rulemaking. And so that's, I think, why some of the regulations and voices being heard need to be a little bit more present so that we actually talk over the voices of industry, which just didn't happen in that particular rulemaking. But I've also heard that there are some groups in that rulemaking that are now going to probably sue the state and say the legislation that, or the rulemaking that happened didn't satisfy this was out of the Environmental Justice Act, was to get manufacturing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it just didn't happen with the rulemaking that was passed. So I think there's ways that we could maybe work through some of this, but it's definitely like in our face that we're gonna have to fight some of that kind of stuff that has to do with the capitalistic society that we live in. So, I don't know if anybody else wants to just say no.
No is the right answer, but I mean, just a specific example, I have a nurse, she's a niece, she's 22, she wants to get an electric car because you get a discount. So these electric car cashback things are going to rich people, right? And poor people that live in an apartment that don't have electric charging thing, they don't have their own home garage with a charging station in it, can't buy an electric car. It's a classic example. And you say you got to get everybody on board. If we really want to get everybody on board, we got to make it so everybody can participate in the solution. And this equity issue, I don't want equity to get in the way of the primary objective of reducing, getting us to net zero, but equity is going to be part of the solution. You know? And I sit on these climate action teams, and when I see, yeah, we're going to make builders put charging stations in the garages of their apartment buildings, I'm like, yeah, that's an equity move. So yeah, I think we have a lot of valid points here.
I put a small defense of capitalism here.
No. Zero.
So one from a political standpoint, if we're going to capitalism, it's probably a loser. Worth acknowledging that there's only a very small part of American society that be like anti-capitalism. Twitter notwithstanding, or whatever it's called these days. And it's also worth pointing out that within capitalism and globalization, which has its problems, the global middle class has exploded. A lot of people have moved from poverty into the global middle class. That's really, that's a justice component, right? One of my favorite little factoids, your refrigerator probably uses 10 times as much electricity as the average Nigerian in their entire life, right? And so like, if you want to kind of expand the scope about like what justice is, I'll be damned if I'm going to tell a Nigerian that they can't have refrigeration, right? And capitalism is bringing it to them. Okay, so we need to kind of temper some of our, you know, to the ramparts kind of advocacy here to think about what it's good at. What capitalism generally is good at is a equitable, or not an equitable, but a fast distribution of resources at the most cost-efficient manner. Capitalism, as it's currently being practiced, doesn't do that. If you really think about capitalism as an economic theory, which is that there should effectively, in a purely capitalist society with no, you know, rent seeking, you should effectively have no profit, right? Because you should be driving yourself to a no profit scenario and where you have the most rapid distribution of resources at the most cost effective manner. We don't have that, right? Where you have massive profits associated with that is around monopolization. The other part of the other end of the capitalism equation is that because of that, you also have a drive towards taking advantage of the environment and of workers associated with it, right? And that's one of the problems. That's the weak underbelly, the soft underbelly of capitalism, is that without the proper protections in there, those profits are maximalized upon the backs of the environment and upon the backs of workers. And so this gets back to that governance issue, about making sure that we have the right governance and having the right protection in there, and in that but that capitalism does have a point here as a way of resource application. I also like to talk about, you know, when I think about Nigerians, about population, which is that typically when people think about like degrowth, I think that's probably the wrong, for me, that's not the right framework, right? I don't particularly care about growth or not. something to be said that if you don't have growth, you do have kind of a zero-sum mindset. People tend to be a little bit more tooth and claw about fights. And then if there's growth, you allow the opportunities for people to be a little bit more civil to one another. But there's also this component about that, like, I don't have a problem with growth. I have a problem with resource abuse. And if you look at like donut economics, also famous in the Netherlands, is the idea is that we're failing actually on both fronts. We're failing both on the social justice issues, like kind of the floor of acceptable behavior, and we're failing on exceeding
Planetary boundaries.
planetary boundaries, right? And where we need to live is somewhere in between those 2
That,
points.
that we is capitalism.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That we has to have some boundaries on it. And that's what I talked about with capitalism, is that like there are more effective ways to do it. One of the reasons I'm a big believer in carbon markets, even though from a policy perspective, it's very difficult to pass because it's hard to explain, it's confusing, it's right for people to kind of paint it one way or the other, is it's a very effective way of leveraging capitalism and capital markets to achieve environmental outcomes. And versus a carbon tax, it's a more cost-effective way of doing it. And so there's a lot of research around that. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Let's focus on, instead of kind of column A or column B, recognize that like the solution is going to be a little bit more nuanced. We're actually going to have to act more nuanced rather than in 140 characters talking about throwing capitalism. That's my 2 cents.
You know, Winston Churchill said that democracy was the worst form of government except for every other form. And capitalism is kind of the same way. It's the worst economic system except for every other. And if you don't believe me, look at what happened in the planned socialist economies of Eastern Europe, North Korea, and China during the 40 years that those countries were under that form of government. Some still are. The environmental problems in those planned socialist economies were horrible. That system was horrible for the environment. We know that. But that doesn't make capitalism good. My suggestion, I prefer what's called social democracy, like they have in many other countries in Europe, with much, much higher taxes, much, much higher public expenditures, and much, much happier people. However, I don't work in the international arena anymore. I'm a sustainability mechanic here in Denver. So if we want to start here, here's some quick ideas of what we could do. 100%, whatever you think of the e-bike vouchers, and we can debate that all evening, how effective they are and so forth. But whatever you think of them, 100% should go to low-income people. It shouldn't be divided up between low-income people and other people the way it is now, 100% for low income. And we shouldn't make transit free to all the transit riders for 2 months a year. We should make it free for the most needy people in our community for 100% of the year, rather than the way that RTD is doing it. And we should also spend some of that money on extending transit service for second and third shift workers, of which my son was one, because they are often the ones who need it the most and get it the least. We should eliminate single family zoning throughout Denver. We should not limit any nature. It's not that we cancel single family homes, but we should allow multifamily homes to be built in any neighborhood in Denver, not the way we're doing it now. The same with accessory dwelling units and so forth. There's a lot of, at our level, we can't affect the world economy or capitalism or anything, but we can affect these things that we do right here in Denver. We're just a little bit more mindful of how to install equity. I'll finish this with just one point. I had a huge fight with our Parks Department when I was in office. They wanted to levy they wanted to create a special fund to acquire parkland in the downtown area. And they assumed I would go along with it because I was the green guy in this parks. I opposed it. I said public money is limited. And if we have public money for parkland acquisition, let's put it in Westwood, let's put it in, the Swansea and so forth. Let's put it there. And they were furious with me. And so, but when we talk about equity, we can talk about it in the abstract. I'm a mechanic, so I talk about it in terms of these specific actions that we can take right now and do it right away if we want to.
So I'm Brandon. I work as a civil engineer for water and wastewater treatment. So a lot of my designs I try to incorporate sustainable practices, especially with pipeline conveyance. And we may have spoken to the same municipality about this, but most of the times I get met with I don't know, I get that negative feedback. And one of the things is that they say, well, we don't have enough money to afford sustainability practices. And it's a pipeline. Like, I source things like ductile iron pipe instead of using PVC. But that's what I'm more so, my question is how do we get municipalities or, you know, smaller private, you know, business owners to invest in this? Like, what is the pitch that needs to go forth? Because I can make it all day, but I don't know any other way to get anybody else involved with it.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned pipes. Because, actually, believe it or not, a lot of energy is expended in pushing water through pipes. And there's different ways to make pipes. There's a company in, I think, Birmingham, Alabama called American Ductile that has a pipe with much lower friction. So people don't think about that when they think about climate change, like changing your pipes. But it can actually make a big difference. You know, 80% at least of sustainability problems are finance problems, and they always follow the same pattern. There's a big expenditure you have to make up front to save money later on. And that's the way, if you get cities to think about that, you get cities to think about it in terms of being a finance problem, then you can begin to address it, because you use the savings from the future to pay for the upfront costs right now. And Sharon, I'm sure that you folks talk to a lot of people about the PACE program that we have in Colorado, the Property Assessed Clean Energy, program, which does exactly what I just described. It's been available for years. It is underutilized. It's out there. It's a great way for local governments to work with their communities to get a lot of this stuff done. Montana just adopted it. I'm working with the community up there to get it started up there. So if you think of sustainability as a finance problem, think of the solutions that way. 80% of what we need to do will happen that way.
Brief comment, I'll keep mine brief. There's a movie, Moonstruck, plumber. Costs you money because it saves you money. And that's what he says. And as with our ecosystem service evaluation, climate scientists were like, we have to deal with this climate change. And the economists said it's going to be too expensive to deal with climate change. And we're realizing now that it's going to be way more expensive to deal with it because we didn't deal with it, which is the same principle. So I appreciate your problem every day, and I wish you good luck in winning. You're right in winning the logical argument, but for some reason, evidence and logic don't work with a lot of people.
I think if you look at sometimes life cycle costing instead, like there's really good bodies of knowledge out there, but not a lot of people know how to do it well. When it comes to like energy and water savings, it all depends on how much your water and energy cost in the local area, which in Colorado is not very expensive. I came from Atlanta, Georgia, where we had the highest cost of water literally in the country. So I could sell water saving projects really super easy. And then I moved to other places where it just didn't cost as much and I couldn't talk people into the payback. So if you switch over to, let's say, a little bit more of a life cycle costing, because if you say to this municipality, it's going to cost you this much over the next 30 or 40 years to operate this, but if you do this one change to the design, it's going to cost you this. You might have a little bit more weight in some of the conversation. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think it's one of the struggles that we have when you're just looking at your space and water heating equipment. These things have 20, 30 years of life cycle. You're not going to change out that piece of equipment because it's saving you more energy, because the payback is not there. If you just look at it from an energy savings payback, so you're going to replace it at the end of its system life, but you need to plan well so it's not an emergency replacement. And in most building cycles right now, the majority of facility managers, especially nonprofit and municipal, they do it when it breaks because they don't have the funding to then plan. But if you kind of get them into thinking of more preventive maintenance or reactive, so they're not reactive. Thinking through life cycle costing, that's what we're trying to do literally within our general services department in the city of Denver is how do we plan for electrification of our space and water heating equipment? And we're looking at life cycle costing to understand that if we plan to replace this in 2029, when the system is going to probably be at the end of its life anyways, we're going to save this much money over the lifetime of the system. And so you might have a little bit more of a better argument doing that rather than I'm just going to save you a little bit more in running this system in the short term. It's a little bit more of you're going to do less maintenance, the operations are smoother, over time you're going to save this much money out of your budget. Some of those types of arguments sometimes work a little bit better on that. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy because that municipality is probably going to go, well, I had this much money this year and that's it. But there's a huge amount of funding happening right now out of the federal government with IRA, all of these more where they could possibly get these chunks of money to upgrade their system so that they are using less carbon or are using less fossil fuels or, less energy to run the systems and you have better quality water, all of that kind of stuff. There's arguments to be made to get big chunks of money out of the federal government right now that are not going to be there, let's say 10 or 20 years from now. And so that might be putting together this funding from the federal government that city could get this big chunk and then putting it together with life cycle costing analysis may be a really good argument.
I obviously don't have anything to add on municipal government. I would say maybe from the business half of your question, I kind of appreciate you throwing that little bone in there for me. Anybody here ever heard of like Six Sigma? Yeah, so Six Sigma is this idea is around that, like Sigma is a standard deviation. They want to get 6 standard deviations away from center for quality control. And a little history lesson is that for a long time, quality control was seen as a cost center for business. To have good quality cost you money. And the reality of the situation was the Japanese didn't see it that way. They kind of interlooked on the manufacturing capacity in the 80s. All of a sudden, you had a lot of converts that talked about, well, maybe we do need to focus on quality control. And I think that there's kind of a lesson there in business as far as like the language of historically you've thought of this behavior as a cost, but in reality, it's an investment and it's a profit center. This is how you build brand loyalty. This is how you reduce costs of maintenance and labor. There's a lot of things kind of built into that. So if you can potentially co-opt some of the history of business and some of the language of business in order to achieve this, I think you may find some more success.
I'm just going to throw a thought in here about what might be sort of behind this resistance that we're talking about, these barriers. In the change work I do, talk about, I think try to attack the myth that people oppose change, that people resist change. We hear that a lot, right? People don't like to change. We get stuck in our ways. So you try to change something, you get resistance. There's all the change curve stuff. We learn on how you people go through the change curve. And that there's a lot of validity to that approach, but there's a piece that's missing from it, I think, which is that I believe that people don't resist change, they resist losses. They are either real losses or feared losses. So when we ask people to take climate action, we're asking them to think about the future, right? Many of them are thinking about next week. And they're wondering, what do I have to give up? What are you going to take away from me? What am I going to lose? I mean, why does Manchin have supported coal miners in West Virginia? Why do we have many industrial workers holding on to the past? It's about fear. So I think that's just something we, if we want to work on climate, need to look at. 2 questions I'd ask us to think about as we're looking at these different issues, which is who's going to lose what, and how are we going to deal with that, and who has to learn what, and how we're going to deal with that. So I'm just going to throw that out as the conversation continues. We've about 10 more minutes for Q&A, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Or can I add to that?
Sure.
I had a realization when I was doing sustainability work in New York City, where like you all are change agents. Like the fact that you are here learning about this means that you want to do something about it, which means you are interested in creating change in our communities and our state and that kind of thing. And as I was doing this work, I was going through like some change management training and things like that. And change makes people uncomfortable. It makes them fearful because it's something different than what they're doing now. And so as a change agent, you are trying to get people to change their behaviors and the way we've done things and break down these systems and these silos. So basically, as a change agent, you are in the business of making people uncomfortable. Period. So once you accept that, this happened to me about 10 years ago. I am in the business of making people uncomfortable. So as long as you accept that and to kind of help them work through those systems and changing, if you can do that, you are going to be an incredible change agent. We're going to do all some really cool stuff. So just internalizing that particular issue and being okay with making people uncomfortable is going to set you up for some really cool things in the next couple of days.
Thanks. Hey y'all, I'm Nikki. First conversation about leadership, so thanks for leading the charge. We've thrown out a lot of terms I'm familiar with as a business person and marketer: loss aversion, fear of change, all of these things. Degrowth is basically a swear word in the business world. Yeah, don't even say the D word, how dare you. And I think you're bringing up a lot of interesting conversations for the climate curious and the climate engaged. My question is kind of two pieces. You can answer either, none, both. First, from the more capitalist, we are in a business world, I work in the business industry. How are you seeing the normal people, the not a climate professional people, helping influence maybe not degrowth to your point, but a shift closer to donut economics theory? A, and B, if not that, I think y'all are scientists or close there. If scientists are the brain, marketers are the mouth. What do you guys need, or what do you think marketers need to be doing besides making your voices louder? Because what I've heard a lot of is people saying, why didn't you yell at us more? When you guys have been screaming since the 70s. 60s, thank you. Sorry, that's worse.
40.
Listen, let's keep this optimistic.
You just opened up a whole can of worms. Go ahead.
Well, I understand that we want growth. Here's a Nigeria example. Business as usual will produce more Nigerians between now and 2050 than it will put refrigerators in Nigeria. Nigeria is on track to pass the United States, become the third most populous country in the world. It still comes down to, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And we have to decide where we want to go, right? And the IPCC, which is the climate change scientists, their models, they get right, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, another suite of thousands of scientists from all over the world say, where we're going, we want to have a just, desirable, and sustainable future is a smaller global population and reduced material and energy consumption that is typically measured by GDP. And so if we're not aiming for that, we're just going to believe that enough solar panels and enough wind turbines, and we can all have flying cars. We want that fantasy. We can keep building the house of cards. The house of cards is already collapsing. Half the coral reefs are dead. Half the wetlands are gone. There's fires in Canada that are getting people in New York to notice. People that live in Evergreen and Conifer up in the hills here in Colorado are getting these wacky new insurance bills. We're going, ooh, climate change is affecting me personally. My fire insurance went from $1,000 a month to $12,000 a year, $1,000 a year to $12,000 a year. So for me, the laws of nature are not negotiable. And I make people uncomfortable. I do with my students all the time. Your green growth fantasies are not going to work out. So, I mean, that's my take on it. I'm fairly confident that I'm right, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we'll grow our way out of it. I'm not master of the universe, never will be master of the universe. But I have lots of friends that are into relocalizing themselves. That nobody fantasizes about living off the grid, but they're definitely trying to live in smaller ways and be more resilient. And that would be my advice to everybody: be more resilient. Whatever that means to you, whether it's with food or energy or whatever. But I still think this, there's two things I don't like: change and the way things are.
So we obviously disagree a little bit on the growth side of things.
Don't disagree with me in the IPCC about it.
So, when we talk about depopulation, typically we're talking about those people, these people. And I think that's a real problem usually. And so that's historically Nigerians have almost like zero culpability for this.
Climate change, yeah. Zero culpability.
That's right.
Well, they sell a lot of oil.
So the average Nigerian doesn't. And so I think there's a component about that. And so for me, it's about like individual action is part of how we drive a larger system. You want to see where population actually has gone down in places. It's undergone through incredibly authoritarian mechanisms like the one China or the one child policy in China, or it's gone through an increased living standard. And so I haven't seen a whole lot of other options. Go ahead.
I have to kind of disagree on this whole concept because it has to do with the empowerment of women and education of women. The women in Nigeria don't want to have 12 kids. That's not some big wake up and say, hey, I want to have 12 kids. They want to see their kids get to full life. So we already know how to reduce population is by educating women. This is scientifically, this has been shown to work over and over again. And here in America is also, we talk about it, but we also try to do it with birth control. So I disagree with your concept that when we say reduce the population, it's, oh, we're talking about them. Because that's not true. When I talk about other countries, I'm talking about educating the women and giving them opportunities that they didn't have to raise the 2 kids that they should be able to have and to take to full adulthood. And so I just didn't like that concept that we don't know how to do it and that we're blaming. Because this isn't about blaming, this is about educating women.
Oh, I don't think I suggested that I was blaming anybody.
Okay.
And I do 100% women's empowerment is a pretty core component of that, and that goes with raising living standards. And so when those women are trying to make decisions about how many children are going to get to adulthood,
right,
they need to know that their children are going to survive.
Right.
And they need to know that they can feed those children. And that comes from also quality of life, right? And so 100% women's empowerment and education is a very core component to that. But I also think we're beyond the point of where we have silver bullets. There's a lot of, we're in silver buckshot land where we have to kind of do all the things.
Oh,
Women's empowerment is one of them. But I still don't think that there's a pathway here without at least a certain degree of increasing living standards in the developing world.
Of course.
And so if we're not talking about that, we're just really not talking about reducing population. So, this is kind of the rock and a hard place that we find ourselves in, right? Which is that we have to improve the living standards in the developing world. We also have to control the amount of resources that we're going there. I don't think it is either A or B. You can either be this sunny techno-optimist where we're going to have fusion reactors in 3 years, or it's going to be throw capitalism to the curb. We're all going to go live on communes. There's a whole lot of spot in between, right? Okay, and we know what we need to be doing.
Right.
So I would say all of that. I would also say this from engaging the population component, which is if you look at like the Pew Research polls, they talk about that even the least engaged generation on climate, the boomers, are over 20% engagement. And when I say engagement, I mean they've written a politician, they've contributed to a nonprofit, or they've attended a political rally. Like this isn't just like I posted on social media. Like this is legitimate engagement. It's double that for Gen Z and millennials, right? But even 1 in 5 boomers, like there's good political science out there that talks about that. Once you get over about like 3% of the population well engaged on something, it starts moving. It starts moving pretty significantly. So even our least engaged generation is well beyond the threshold of being engaged enough to start seeing action. So I guess I kind of leave you with one thought here, which is if you double adoption of something, like say every 3 years, right? That's an incredibly fast growth rate, right? Like if you could get to double adoption every 3 years, bananas fast. It's going to feel like you're losing until about 3 years from the end. Because you're not going to be 50% of the way that the last 50% is going to happen in the last 3 years. Okay, so it can be really kind of like depressing, but I'm actually not a techno optimist. But I am optimistic about that we are starting to see the curve get bent. Okay, RCP 8.5, the catastrophic worst case scenario is increasingly less likely. You know, the world's probably going for about 3 degrees warming. That's terrible. That's a catastrophe, right? But it's not an apocalypse. Okay, so you know, I'm not saying that like that's like cause for optimism, you know, in itself. But the curve's bent, and anybody that's been working in climate for more than a couple of years knows that that is an incredible amount of change that's happened in only a few years. Okay, so don't be a Pollyanna about this. There's a lot of work left to do, but also recognize that like the shit's turning. We're on the way. So just keep working.
To try to answer your question, if I remember, it was basically what do we say to people? You know, what do we say to people? So when I was the chief sustainability officer, one of my rules was I would never argue with people about whether climate change was real or whether it existed or anything like that. Climate doesn't care. Climate's not like Tinkerbell, where you need to believe in that ants and everything, so Tinkerbell comes back to life. No, it doesn't care. Climate doesn't care whether we declare a climate change emergency. It makes no difference to the climate. The climate only cares now about what we do next. So what we tried to do in my office was, and I'm still doing this in my practice advising local governments, is whatever we want people to do or think will help to mitigate climate change, we have to sell it to them in some way that never mentions climate change. We have to sell it to them, this is an advantage to you because we are not here, we should not be here to convince the public of our beliefs. We are here to take their beliefs and make them work for us. You know, you want more money, you want to save money, we'll show you how to do that. You like leisure time, you know, we'll show you how to do that. We'll show you how to get more leisure time by converting your lawn to xeriscaping, and then you will save money on your watering bills and you won't have to mow the lawn and so forth. You know, whatever we put into a climate and sustainability plan, when I'm advising local government, we have to be able to sell it for something that has nothing to do with sustainability or climate and has something to do with what they want. And we have to find out what they want and make that work for us, because that's how you get, you know, that's how you get at people.
Well, we're going to wrap it up here in just a minute. I'm going to have one closing question for the panel before we do. Thank you all for your great questions. I think we've heard this is a pretty complex issue. With lots of things that are related. Would have thought we'd be talking about reproductive rights tonight. But it's part of this, it's part of the issue. These things are all related. And we've heard, you know, different views on how we go at it through, you know, private sector incentives, engaging the business world to handle it, or needing to actually change the economic system. So we have some diversity of views across the panel. And that's all healthy too. We also probably have heard underneath it all some optimism of, you know, the big tanker, to use that metaphor, that oil tanker that's hard to turn is turning, and maybe it's going to go a different direction. Or we also see, though, you can look in the short run, the carbon we're putting in the atmosphere up every year. So we can have different views on that. So with all this going on, my question to the panel is, given all this, given the challenges to effective action, particularly effective collective action, what keeps you in the game?
The International Energy Agency just released its annual report, which I found very encouraging. It says there is still a path to 1.5 degrees centigrade. It's getting narrower, it's getting harder, but they went through all the elements of that path, including the very rapid changes in technology that could really be game changers for us, changes in government and so forth. No guarantee that it will happen, but basically that document, if you want to Google search International Energy Agency Annual Report 2023, just read the executive summary and you'll actually feel pretty good about where we could be headed. If we put our shoulders to the wheel, if we put our minds to it, if we work together, there is still a path, and that's what keeps me going.
That is such an interesting question. I think for me, it's relationship building, like the work that I've done, especially in the last 5 years on building performance policies that will have like actionable results that are going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, involves so much relationship building. Like the message that we're putting out there right now is the Office of Climate Action wants you to hit these goals. We don't want to do penalties. If you're having issues reaching these goals, let's have a conversation. And so we can help you figure out how to reach those goals. And then the amount of like stakeholder engagement we did with the building industry and engineers and service providers to figure out how to implement this program in a way where the buildings could actually do the work and not put up so many barriers in front of them or trying to reduce the barriers. It's all about relationships. It's all about stakeholder engagement and you all getting involved in some way in the space, whether it's influencing policy, sitting in a focus group of somebody who wants to implement something and helping us figure out exactly how to do that. I love that. And so that I think is how we're going to fix a lot of these issues, but it takes involvement. Like I have talked to thousands of people over the last couple of years just to get this one little policy working in Denver. And that to me is encouraging because people are being involved. So I think that's where we make improvements and actually move forward on these goals.
I'll riff on Sharon's idea. Why do I get out of bed every day? I like people like Mike. I like arguing with them. And I like the people that are in this audience, right? The people that really want to make the world a better place. They want to serve the public good. I clash heads with my business majors, some of them, that are fully profit motivated. But I enjoy the people that are really worried about the common good and the trajectory of the human experiment, right? I would like to think that Homo sapiens will be building space shuttles and space telescopes and writing Hamlet plays and Hamilton plays and doing all kinds of cool things. I think there are so many cool things we do as human beings, and I'd like to think that we could do that for a long time. So that's why I get out of bed every day. I also recognize that degrowth is inevitable. It's gonna happen, whether people want to believe it or not. I don't know if we're gonna get to 12 billion or we'll only get to 9 billion, but our population is gonna get to some point and it's gonna come down. And every model says it's gonna come down. There's a very low possibility it could get to 0, but it's probably gonna stabilize somewhere around 1 to 2 billion people. The question is, that little ride down, we have some agency as to how that ride down happens. And we can avoid a lot of human suffering, or we can cause a lot of human suffering through our neglect and failure to recognize biophysical reality. So I really like everybody here. I'm sure I would enjoy chatting with everybody in this room. I'm going to keep tilting my sword at the windmill with my opinion and clash with Mike, and maybe there will be a thesis and an antithesis and a synthesis, and it'll be fun watching it go forward. I hope we can avoid a lot of human suffering. So that's what gets me out of bed.
I like you too, Paul. I don't really have a great answer. It's the short answer. There's this part of me when I was a kid, like, you go camping and then like there's like the people that leave messes and there's the people that clean them up. My family was always the clean them up kind, right? And so like I think there's like this component, it's just who I am. You know, I'm a father, so I think about like the world I'm leaving to my children. You know, so that's part of it. I think there's a component of like I deal with a lot of people. And in my particular line of work, I don't deal with the highly climate motivated. There's more what we call them like climate curious. You know what I mean? I don't really deal with it. To Jerry's point, the climate denialists, I see far fewer of them. And when they do deny it, they're a lot less vehement. They're starting to feel kind of stupid making the argument. So I guess, you know, we'll schadenfreude there for me. You know, but if I was to tie it to kind of some high-minded principle, which is that the IPCC said in 2018 about that, like every decision matters, every fraction of a degree matters, and every year matters. And so I don't think there's a decision that's too big or too small for us to be thinking about. And it's a little bit of the cross you have to bear once you become a little bit more climate aware to recognize that literally every decision you make has that effect too, right? You know, but that's also opportunity. It's a way to kind of shape the future to take a little bit of ownership. And I think when I'm seeing people that engage in climate, they universally have kind of a moment of despair for a little while because it's some really heavy stuff when you're talking about like the end of nature. And like a lot of like human suffering, because those are all like very real things. There's a whole security component that we haven't even talked to about tonight on, you know, my military background. But then like kind of on the back end of that despair, usually there's actually, I wouldn't say it's optimism, but just like a sense of personal relief because you have agency and you're participating in the work. That's something I find of value. That's all I got.
I'm gonna just give an example of what keeps me in work. And this was a article from, just lost it here, an article from the Washington Post on the day of my birth. They sent it to me on my birthday a few years ago. And it was the head of the National Geographical Society saying that release of carbon dioxide from carbon fuels is warming the atmosphere, that the current warm spells we're handling are going to get more and more frequent, and that in another century or so, this will be a significant threat to the Earth. So my reason is, it took me a long time to wake up, so I better get to work now. With that, I just want to thank the panel. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn it over for a closing to our sponsor.
Yeah, please round of applause. Well, that was a fantastic, well thought out discussion. Thank you, all of you. I really, really appreciate it. I think everyone in this room does as well. That was very, very well done. Just wanted to say a couple more things. So DCFR has a few events here coming up. In November, we have Jason Crow coming over and talking with us at the DCFR. So if anyone's interested in coming to that event, please visit our website. We have some flyers over here for you. We also plan on doing another one of our YPC events in January on the refugee crisis that we see in the United States and all over the world. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. So again, thank you so much. This was absolutely fantastic. Mike, to your point, I wanted to say, I was always taught to leave a place better than when I came. So I really, that resonated. So thank you, everybody. There's plenty of time to mingle. We have plenty of alcohol left. There's some food. Thank you so much.
There. Sorry, Duke is bad word.